Welcome to the Metapolitical Podcast, where we analyze politics beyond ideology, focusing on what is, not what should be. This is your host, Jim Jakiko. Today's episode is about the politics of statistics. We're going to examine how statistics get used in political discourse, specifically around race. We're going to deconstruct how certain statistical claims function rhetorically, what assumptions they require, what they obscure, and what political work they do. This is not about whether discrimination exists or doesn't exist, or what policies should change. This is about how statistical framing operates and what it reveals about how we think about causation, measurement, and explanation. Why don't we start with a common example? You've probably encountered this framing before. 13% of the US population is Black, but they're responsible for 50% of violent crime. This statistic gets cited frequently in political discourse. It shows up in comment sections, in political debates, and arguments about policing and criminal justice. And the way it's presented suggests it's just a neutral fact, just data, just reality that needs to be acknowledged. But let's examine what's actually happening in this framing. First, what is the statistic claiming to show? On its surface, it presents a correlation between a demographic characteristic, being Black, and an outcome measure, crime statistics. The juxtaposition of these two numbers invites a particular inference. If 13% of the population accounts for 50% of some measured outcome, the implicit suggestion is that there's something about that 13% that explains the 50%. The demographic characteristic, again, being Black, is being positioned as explanatory. But what is actually being measured here? The statistics say responsible for crime, but what does that mean operationally? Is this measuring criminal behavior or is it measuring something else? What crime statistics actually measure is not behavior in the world. They measure the output of the criminal justice system. They measure arrests, charges, convictions, incarcerations. These are system outputs, not direct observations of behavior. This is a crucial distinction that gets collapsed in the framing. Just think about it. If police patrol certain neighborhoods more intensively, arrests in those neighborhoods are going to increase. If prosecutors charge certain defendants more aggressively, convictions increase. If judges sentence certain convicted individuals more harshly, incarceration rates increase. The system's own practices shape what gets counted. So when we see disparities in crime statistics, we're seeing disparities in how the system works, not necessarily disparities in underlying behavior. Consider this for a minute. Let's say two populations use illegal drugs at roughly similar rates. But law enforcement focuses its resources on one population's neighborhoods. That population will have higher arrest rates for drug offenses. The statistic will show a disparity. But the disparity reflects enforcement patterns, not behavior patterns. What this statistic actually measures is how the police behave, not the ones being policed. This matters because the framing responsible for 50% of the crime treats the statistic as if it's capturing objective behavior, but it's actually capturing a complex interaction between behavior, enforcement, prosecution, and systemic practices. When you say someone is responsible for something, you're making a causal claim. You're saying they did it. But the statistic is showing who got caught, who got charged, who got convicted. Those are different things. Those are fundamentally different things. Now, what gets obscured in this framing? Several things. First, what counts as crime and what doesn't? The statistic typically refers to violent crime or street crime. But what about white-collar crime, tax evasion, wage theft, corporate fraud, environmental violations? These cause enormous social harm, arguably more social harm than street crime, but they're either not categorized as crime in the same way, or they're not enforced with the same intensity. So the very category of crime is already shaped by what gets policed and what doesn't. It also obscures socioeconomic factors. So poverty, unemployment, lack of educational opportunity, Historical segregation. These structural conditions are correlated with certain types of crime. But when you present a demographic statistic and a crime statistic side by side without any context, you're implicitly suggesting the demographic characteristic itself is doing the explanatory work. You're obscuring the structural factors that might actually be driving the correlation. This kind of talk obscures historical context. Discriminatory housing policy, employment discrimination, criminal justice disparities. These aren't ancient history. Redlining shaped where people could live and build wealth. The GI Bill excluded Black veterans. Mass incarceration policies targeted specific communities. These historical factors have ongoing effects. But presenting just two numbers, population percentage and crime percentage, it strips all of that away. It presents the disparity as if it exists in a vacuum, as if it's just a natural fact about demographics. And finally, this type of framing obscures the self-fulfilling nature of the system. If you believe a particular population commits more crime, you police them more. If you police them more, you arrest them more. If you arrest them more, the statistics show higher crime rates for that population, which then justifies more policing. This statistic becomes evidence for the very practices that produce the statistic. It's circular. So what causal story does this framing invite? When you present a demographic characteristic and an outcome side by side, you are inviting essentialism. You're suggesting that there's something inherent to that demographic group that explains the outcome. Maybe it's cultural, maybe it's biological, maybe it's behavioral. The specific mechanism is left strategically vague, but the structure of the argument suggests this group is like this, and that's why this outcome exists. It's racial essentialism. It's the idea that race as a category has explanatory power for social outcomes, that being a member of a racial group tells you something meaningful about behavior, capability, or character. And the statistic? It's being used to support that essentialist claim. And here's what's interesting about all of this. This framing often presents itself as the simplest, most straightforward explanation. Just look at the numbers, it says. The correlation is right there. But is a demographic trait really the simplest explanation? Occam's razor, the philosophical razor that says the simplest explanation is the best explanation, it gets invoked a lot in these discussions. But what is actually simpler? Is it simpler to suggest that there's something inherent about being Black that causes certain behaviors? Something biological or cultural or essential that transcends context, history, and circumstance? Or is it simpler to observe that when you concentrate poverty in specific areas, reduce economic opportunity, underfund schools, and then heavily police those same areas, you get predictable outcomes that show up in your enforcement statistics? The demographic explanation might seem simple because it's contained in a single variable, race. But that apparent simplicity hides an enormous amount of complexity. You would need to explain the mechanism. How exactly does demographic membership cause behavior? What is the causal pathway there? The structural explanation might involve more variables, but each variable has a clear observable mechanism. Poverty affects behavior through material constraint. Policing affects statistics through enforcement patterns. These are straightforward causal relationships. So when someone invokes simplicity to support a demographic explanation, you have to ask, what is actually being simplified here? It's not just collapsing complex structural factors, it's rendering them invisible. So then you end up with demographic correlations that seem like they're the only thing left to explain the outcome. But what if the causal story is this? Systemic inequality produces concentrated poverty. Concentrated poverty then produces certain social conditions, and those conditions are correlated with certain types of crime. The criminal justice system disproportionately focuses on those conditions and those communities. That is a very different explanation because it locates the cause in systems and structures, not demographic characteristics. Or what if the causal story is over-policing produces higher arrest rates, prosecutorial practices produce higher conviction rates, and sentencing practices produce higher incarceration rates? And all of these practices are applied unevenly across populations. Again, very different explanation. The disparity is being produced by the system, not the population. Now, let's unpack the political work that this framing does. First, it naturalizes disparities. If you can attribute an outcome to an inherent characteristic of a group, then the outcome seems inevitable. It's just the way things are. It's not something that needs to be explained by policy, by history, or by structure. It is explained by the group itself. This removes scrutiny from systems and institutions. It shifts the focus from what is the criminal justice system doing to what is this demographic group doing. It also legitimizes disparate treatment. If a group is responsible for a disproportionate amount of crime, then it seems reasonable to police them disproportionately, to surveil them more, to treat them with more suspicion. The disparity in enforcement becomes justified by the statistic, even though the statistic is partially produced by the enforcement. It's a closed loop. And then it preempts discussion of systemic change. If the problem is located in group characteristics, Black people or any other kind of minority group, rather than in systems, then what's there to reform? You cannot reform a demographic group, but you can reform policies, practices, and institutions. By framing the disparity as a demographic fact rather than a systemic outcome, the argument forecloses certain types of political intervention before they're even proposed. Now, this same pattern shows up in other contexts too. Take welfare statistics. You'll often see claims about what percentage of welfare recipients are Black, framed in a way that suggests something about dependency or work ethic or cultural attitudes. But this framing obscures several things. First, what counts as welfare and what doesn't? Direct cash assistance gets counted and stigmatized. Meanwhile, mortgage interest deductions, agricultural subsidies, corporate tax breaks, or socialism, those don't get counted as welfare, even though they're government transfers. So the category itself is already shaped by political and cultural assumptions about what deserves scrutiny. By focusing on this myth of the welfare queen, we are not instead talking about why people even need assistance to begin with. Framing the receipt of welfare as a racialized statistic, that suggests the explanation is something about the recipients themselves. It is the same essentializing move. Now, what about educational statistics? You have achievement gaps, test scores, graduation rates. These are often presented with racial breakdowns that suggest inherent differences in capability or effort. But this obscures funding disparities between school districts, the effects of segregation, differences in access to resources, and even the cultural bias in standardized testing. There are opportunity gaps that exist before children even enter school. The statistic presents an outcome, and the framing suggests a cause, but the suggested cause is demographic and not anything else. These examples share a common structure. A statistic is presented that shows a correlation between a demographic characteristic and a specific outcome. The framing invites an essentialist explanation. Something about the group explains the outcome. Alternative explanations that locate the cause in systems, structures, policies, or even historical factors are obscured or foreclosed. And the political effect is to naturalize the disparity, to shift focus from systems to groups, and to legitimize existing arrangements. This is what I mean by the politics of statistics. The numbers themselves might be accurate as measurements, but the selection of which numbers to present, how to present them, what context to include or exclude, and what comparisons to make, all of this is political. It shapes what seems to need explanation and what the explanation seems to be. The question is not whether the statistic is true or false in some narrow sense. The question is, what is it measuring? What is it obscuring? What causal story is it inviting? And what political work is it doing? These questions don't deny that disparities exist. They ask how we explain them. And that question, how we explain disparities, that's fundamentally political, because how we explain them shapes what we think should be done, who's responsible, what needs to change, and what is considered natural versus what's considered a problem that requires intervention. Racial essentialism suggests that race tells you something meaningful. Statistics get deployed to support this framing by presenting correlations as if they're self-explanatory, but they're not. Every correlation requires a causal explanation, and the choice of explanation, well, that's where the politics lives. Statistics are neutral, but the way they're used is not. The way they're framed, the context they're given or denied, the explanations they invite. All of this shapes political discourse. And recognizing that is the first step to understanding what's actually being argued when someone cites a number. And that brings us to the end of the episode. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.